Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth, and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the President, bills brought from the House of Representatives, petition, papers, reports from committees.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed on the order paper in my name. The 13th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, 3rd session, 2017-2018, 11th Parliament, on the examination of the audited accounts, balance sheets, and other financial statements of the Union Estate Electricity Generation Company Limited, UEEGCL, for the financial years 2008 to 2015.
Urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
To the Honorable Minister of Health, in light of recent reports that HIV health care is being denied to migrants, can the Minister indicate whether this is government's policy?
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the article on page 20 of the Express was based on Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine's speech yesterday, in which she quoted UNC policy. UNC policy in 2015 was to deny care to migrants with HIV/AIDS. If you read paragraph 5 of the article, this government, which is a caring government that does not have a dark soul like the UNC, we do not subscribe to that. And I made it abundantly clear, and if you read the article, Minister denies migrants being turned away. So I give this chamber the assurance that we have reversed UNC policy, which Professor Antoine based her speech on, and we give free testing and treatment to everybody with HIV/AIDS. And the same way I give that assurance is the same assurance I gave this country when I said I will bring down maternal mortality rates. Done. It's the same assurance I gave this country when I said I will bring down infant mortality rates. Done. Because they could not do it. The same assurance I gave this country when I said we will do cataract surgeries. Done. We have done it. So the assurance I give that we are giving HIV drugs free to everybody is the same assurance I gave on maternal mortality. Done. Same assurance I gave in bringing down infant mortality rates. Done. The same assurance I gave on doing cataract surgery for poor people so they don't have to go to the private sector. Done. All of those things have been done. Because we reverse UNC policy to introduce a health card which was to bar those people from getting HIV drugs. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the government will answer the 3 questions on notice which are due for response. That is question number 1, 157, 158, and 160. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Question number 157 to the Minister of Works and Transport.
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the answer to part 1, Uber was unable to comply with the requirements of the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act, Chapter 4850, which governs the use of motor vehicle for public transportation service in Trinidad and Tobago. In particular, despite being asked to do by the ministry, Uber did not produce evidence of insurance for the vehicles used by its drivers for public transportation. Part 2 of the question, it is noteworthy that the company ended its operation in Trinidad and Tobago at the end of May 2018, and so part 2 of this question is not applicable. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Could the Minister indicate whether the same company, Uber, made available to the Ministry all relevant documentation as requested for its operations?
No, Senator Mark, that doesn't apply. No, but that is the question at 1 that was answered. So, next supplementary.
The Minister said that Uber has left Trinidad and Tobago. Could you tell us when they left?
He did, Senator Mark. That was also answered in the question.
When was it?
At the end of May 2018. Next question, Senator Mark.
Sorry.
You have a supplementary?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Uber is not so much a transportation company, but a coordinating company. Has the ministry considered looking at policies in future, because our whole dynamic is changing? Have you considered looking at policies that would facilitate companies such as Uber, who really rely on technology rather than the actual transport?
Minister.
Thank you. Madam President, the question, if I understand it, is a question, are the Ministry of Works and Transport, and we operate for vehicles for public transport under the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act, Chapter 4850, which deals with transportation. In terms of making new legislation to accommodate the new technology, that was one of the requisites and the requirements that the ministry made to Uber in a joint meeting with the Attorney General's office. Had all those requirements been forthcoming, the Attorney General is quite prepared to look at the legislation, but we cannot accommodate this service which would have been operating outside the law. So the Attorney General office was quite prepared to look at the legislation, providing that they got the required documents from the provider. Those documents were not forthcoming as requested, and unfortunately, that was the end of the process.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Question 158 to the Minister of Public Utilities.
Minister of Public Utilities.
Madam President, the Water and Sewage Authority has advised that the disruption experienced in the supply of pipe-borne water to residents of Penal around May this year was as a result of an intermittent reduction in production from the desalination plant at Point Lisas and the Caroni water treatment plant due to low voltage, as well as mechanical problems with the wells at the Penal water treatment plant. These problems have since been resolved, and the regular pipe-borne water supply has been restored as per the water schedule. WASA is currently exploring a number of options to foster improvements in the water supply to Penal and environs, including upgrading of the Moruga water treatment plant, installation of a standby pump for the South Oropouche boosters, and incorporating and incorporating the abandoned petrotrin wells into the water supply system. Additionally, the completion of construction and operationalization of the Savanetta booster will have a favorable impact on the water supply to the area.
Senator Mark.
Did the Minister mention a water schedule? Did I hear you say water schedule? Would you, Madam President, through you, can the Minister provide this Parliament with an appreciation of the water schedule for this particular community?
Minister.
Madam President, I am unable to provide that at this point in time, but I'm sure we'll be able to be able to do so subsequently. The exact water schedule.
Senator Mark.
Could you also indicate, through you, Madam President, with all these various developments that are being pursued to boost water supply in that area and its environs, can you give the Senate any timeline as to when these works would be completed so that there will be a more regular supply of pipe-borne water for the residents of that area and its environs?
Minister.
Madam President, the major project that is being undertaken by WASA is the Savanetta booster, the upgrading of that Savanetta booster station. And that project is expected to be completed by July, the middle of July this year, with the commissioning of it by very, very soon thereafter. With that project, we expect that the surrounding areas will be improved. As for some of the other projects, with regard to the drilling of the wells in Petrotrin, we are exploring those options, and those will have a little longer gestation period. But the major project is the Savanetta booster, and therefore I will expect that the residents of those areas should be seeing an improvement in their supply definitely by the end of July.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, as it relates to improvement, are you saying, Honourable Minister, that there will be a regular supply 7 days a week of water supply when you talk about improvement, or is it going to be less?
Minister.
Madam President, no, I didn't venture to say that it will be taking it to 24/7, but I expect that the regularity of the supply and the shortest in the schedule, the present schedule, which as I said I will provide you, will improve. But it will not be going to 24/7.
One more. Yeah.
Can I ask, through the Honourable President, when would you be able to supply us with that schedule, please?
Minister.
Madam President, that could be supplied probably before the end of the sitting. Definitely by tomorrow it will be able to be supplied.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Question number 160 to the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs.
Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it is public knowledge that in April 2018, the Honorable Prime Minister appointed a 3-member team of experienced professionals headed by former Permanent Secretary Jackie Wilson to thoroughly review the circumstances surrounding the dismissal of and payment of compensation to the former personal member of staff to the former Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs. As stated in the other place last week, the team submitted its report to the Prime Minister on June 4th, 2018. Further, as also stated in the other place, consistent with the principles of natural justice, the persons affected are being given the right to respond to the findings and conclusions in the report. The investigation into this matter is therefore still ongoing, and it is therefore not appropriate to comment further until the investigative process is complete. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Can I ask the Honourable Minister whether there is, which committee, I should ask Madam President, would be continuing the investigation into the matters that the Honourable Minister mentioned? Would it be the same committee headed by Mrs. Jacqueline Wilson, or is it going to be another committee to give these people, as you said, the right to natural justice to deal with the matters that you have mentioned?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my information is at this point in time, as stated in the answer, the committee is going to, through the Office of the Prime Minister, get these answers from the people who were mentioned in the report. And the intention later is to pass the report over to the Public Service Commission for further information and action if necessary.
Senator Hussain.
Through you, Madam President, can the Minister then confirm that she is saying that the Minister is saying, that the person who was the subject of this investigation was not given the right to be heard during the investigation by the Wilson Committee?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. If the member heard clearly what I said earlier, the investigation is still ongoing, and we are at the point in the investigation where the people mentioned in the report are being contacted and questioned and provided with the necessary information that's present in the report so they could have that opportunity to respond. I would have said that in the answer. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Amin.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate if there is a timeline, a date by which this report is to be completed?
Minister.
I am unable to provide that information at this point in time. As I said before, we are reaching out, the committee is reaching out to the subjects in the report, and when they provide the necessary answer, then the process would continue, but I'm unable to give a timeline at this point in time.
Senator Hussain.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate to this Honourable Senate the terms of reference for this committee, please?
Allow that question. Next, any more supplementary? Okay.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Corporation Tax Act, Chapter 7502, be now read a second time. Madam President, before us is an amendment, a simple amendment to the Corporation Tax Act of Chapter 7502 via Corporation Tax Amendment Bill 2018. And the amendment that the government is seeking to make today is an amendment to Section 6.1 of that Act, which is a section that exempts from corporation tax various sources of income. And we are seeking to amend that section to add to that list of exempt sources of income two additional sources. One is the profits of the National Investment Fund Holding Company Limited, which is a new company that's been created, and interest payable on two companies on bonds issued by that company, which I will hereafter refer to, Madam President, as NIF for ease of reference. Madam President, so to give you a history of what brought this amendment about, we will all in this place remember that in 2009 there was a collapse of the CLICO group, the parent company itself and major subsidiaries, and to alleviate the problem that would otherwise be caused from that collapse to policyholders and to investors in that group, investors meaning depositors, the government provided a bailout to CLICO. That bailout over time totaled $23 billion. This is the money provided to CLICO to help alleviate the problem caused by the collapse of that group. Up to late last year, the total recovered from that loan, which is 9 years later, totaled $7 billion. For various reasons, Madam President, which has been provided to the House previously, the government was unable to recover the outstanding monies in the normal course of things under its memorandum of understanding with the Clico group and the Colonial Life group, and as a result of which it took action to bring this matter to a halt. The operations of CLF were put into liquidation. Clico was put under the control of the central bank, and Clico Investment Bank was also put into liquidation. Arising out of that process, Madam President, the government has been able to secure assets of Clico equal to the amount outstanding on that loan in the sum of $15.6 billion. So the government is now seeking to monetize, because it has received shares, and it is now seeking to monetize those shares. The shares received in settlement of the debt, or the outstanding debt owed by the Clico Group, include shares in Republic Finance Holding Company in the amount of $42.4 million, in One Caribbean Media in the amount of $305,000, 42 million shares in Republic Bank, 305,000 shares in One Caribbean, 61.6 million shares in Angostura Limited, 13.9 million shares in One Caribbean, no, I said One Caribbean already, 4.5 million shares in Whitco, West Indies Tobacco. Those are the shares, those are some of the shares recovered in settlement of the debt. The government, as I said, is now seeking to monetize these shares so that it can get financing to conduct the government's business. So how it is proposing to do that? It has set up a company called the National Investment Fund Holding Company Limited, and that company will, the shares that I identified before will be transferred to that company, and it will comprise the assets of that company. The Republic Bank shares will represent 55% of the assets, Whitco shares 5%, One Caribbean 2%, Angostura Limited 12%, and in addition to the shares recovered from Clico, the government proposes to provide more variety and robustness to that company. It also proposes to transfer shares of Trinidad Generation Unlimited in the amount of $2 million, which will represent 26% of the asset base of that company. All shares that I have previously mentioned will be transferred at market value and will total $7.9 billion in value in assets that that company will hold and own. What the government then intends to do is to use this company to generate what it has estimated should be $4 billion in cash for the purpose of providing service to Trinidad and Tobago. So, in trying to determine how it should go about doing this, monetizing those assets, the government considered three options. One was what is commonly referred to now as the CIF model, the Clico Investment Fund model, which is to transfer assets into the fund and issue units. The second option was to transfer the assets into the fund and issue to the public shares in that company. And the third option is to transfer assets into the fund and issue bonds. So the government did some research, did some market sounding, and determined that the most viable option to generate the kind of interest that it wanted was the last of these three, which is to issue bonds backed by the assets in the company. The reason for this is that if you would look at the performance of the Glico Investment Fund, you would see it is not as robust as had originally been forecasted. And for the same reason, which I will mention shortly, we would expect the receipt of shares, the issue of shares in the new company to be not as interesting to the investing public as the issue of bonds. And I will tell you why. When public issues of this nature are made, a major source of investment in these instruments will tend to be pension fund plans, insurance companies. And these companies are restricted in the types of assets they invest in. There are restrictions on equity type investments, for example, because the intention is to keep the fund robust, and there is always risk in investing in equity. So that a bond tends to be a more solid form of investment because its return is generally guaranteed. There's a specified rate of return that is due on the bond. And if you look at the investment portfolios of most of our pension plans and insurance companies, they tend to be maxed out in terms of equity, and they are more interested in buying bonds. So that the market sounding indicated to the government that there would be a greater interest by the public at large, and these entities in particular, in a bond-type instrument that had a specified return, rather than a share that had a varied return and an unguaranteed return. So that is why the government opted to go with option 3. So it proposes to transfer the assets that I mentioned previously to NIF. The NIF has already been established. It will, in exchange for these assets, receive a note from NIF that indicates that there's a liability in respect of these assets that were transferred. $3.9 billion of that note will be converted to shares in NIF, and so the government will be the sole shareholder in the company. The value of its shares will start out at $3.9 million. And in respect of the balance, NIF will issue bonds to the public at large in nominations of $1,000, and it is pegged at that level because we want the widest possible involvement by the public in these investments. We want to ensure that the ordinary man can, in fact, get involved and invest and benefit from these assets. We have made submissions to the Securities Exchange Commission, both for approval of NIF as an issuer and for the bond that it will issue. We propose to list the bond on the stock exchange to allow for free trading of the bond by whoever invests in the bond originally. We have already submitted draft submissions on the prospectus to the Securities Exchange Commission to facilitate this, because we are hoping to move ahead quite quickly to get this completed. In the normal course of things, Madam President, the transfer of assets will attract stamp duty, and the issue of bonds will also attract stamp duty. So it is the government's intention to utilize the provisions of Section 68(2) of the Stamp Duty Act to exempt these transactions from stamp duty. The government has engaged the Caribbean Information and Credit Rating Services Limited, or CARICRIS as it's commonly known, to assign a credit rating to the bond. First Citizens Brokerage Services Limited has been engaged to work with the Ministry of Finance and its corporate advisory, communication advisory services to undertake a comprehensive marketing program in respect of these bonds. So because we indicated that we're not only targeting sophisticated purchasers, but the man in the street, we want to understand that we want the public at large to get a clear understanding of what the bond is about, what is being offered, what his benefits and obligations and so on will be. So we have engaged the First Citizens, as I said, to do this public campaign together with the Ministry of Finance. So what do you get from this bond? It gives the citizenry indirect access to the assets that are placed in this company, because the company, NIF, will hold the assets and will be receiving dividend income from the companies in which it holds shares. And if you look at the history of these companies, they have all traditionally performed well and all traditionally paid dividends. So the citizens will get an indirect entitlement to the benefits of ownership of those company assets. As I said, we have pitched the value of the bond, no, when I say the value of the bond, the amount of bonds that you can buy, $1,000 per person, the face value to $1,000 per bond, so that it is available to the public at large. We are here today to enhance the benefit of the bond by both exempting the NIF from tax, so that will increase the yield of the NIF and the after-tax yield of the NIF, and we are also seeking to exempt the interest on the bond as that interest is earned by companies. You will see that the amendment is only to the Corporation Tax Act. And the Corporation Tax Act imposes tax on companies only. The reason why there's no need to make a similar amendment to the Income Tax Act, which imposes tax on individuals, is because resident individuals are already exempt from tax on interest income. So this exemption...
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for giving way, but I'm hearing about the bonds. I'm not hearing about the interest rate attached to the bonds, and I'm also not hearing about the duration, whether they are long or short bonds. Thank you very much.
Yes. So that the exemption, the provision that we are seeking to pass today will exempt, as I said, the NIF, and in respect of the bonds, which I think the public at large will be more interested in, it will provide two companies exemption from corporation tax, and because of the provisions of the business levy, because of the provisions in the business levy legislation, there will be a roll-on exemption of business levy in respect of that income. So you will not pay corporation tax on the interest income, you will not pay business levy on the income. You will, however, if you're a company, pay green fund levy, which is 0.3%, right? The NIF is also not being exempted from green fund levy, okay? An additional benefit of the bond is because it's being listed on the stock exchange, it allows for easy trading in the bond, so that we anticipate an increase in the value of the bond, and therefore people should be able to generate what would normally be a capital gain, which is not normally taxable, on the sale of those bonds if they decide to sell it before maturity. We are hopeful that we can do the issue and complete it between July 11th and August 8th of this year. And the rates, Senator Mahabir, to your point, we are proposing a 3-tranche approach. 5-year bonds at a coupon of 4.5%. 12-year bonds at a coupon of 5.7%, and 20-year bonds at a coupon of 6.6%. Now, I have done the calculation to determine what the equivalent return would be if the bond would have to be as a taxable bond to give you this kind of return after tax. And it would have to be for a company paying 30%, 6.4%. For a company paying 35%, this is on the 5-year bond, the return would have to be 6.9% to be equivalent to what the government is offering you. In respect of a 12-year bond, the return to a normal company would have to be 8.1%, and to a company paying 35%, which would be the banks and the petrochemical companies, the return would have to be 8.7%. On the 20-year bond, to generate a 6.6 return, if it was taxable, the return would have to be 9.4% to the normal company and 10.2% to the company paying 35%. So you will see that the rate of tax as the rate of return as a tax-free return is very attractive indeed. Okay, so that in each year that these bonds are held by the investor will get an interest return at the rates I've quoted here, depending on the tenor of the bond he has purchased. And at the end of that period, he will recover his capital investment. You will remember that the NIF will retain. But the intention is to raise financing in respect essentially of 50% of the assets that the NIF will hold. So the NIF will then be earning dividend income in respect of the other 50% of the assets that it holds and retaining that income. It will take the income generated from those dividends and invest it to be able to settle in whole or in part the liability as they become due. Yes, so that's the intention. That is how the structure is supposed to operate. At the end of the 20-year period, which is when the last of the bonds will be paid off, the government, through the NIF, will continue to be the 100% owner of these bonds. So that essentially is how it is intended to operate. So, Madam President, to get to the bill itself, the bill itself is relatively simple. It has two clauses. One is the title clause, and the title is Corporation Tax Amendment Bill 2018. And the second clause is the clause which introduces the amendments. It makes some consequential amendments in terms of renumbering and that kind of thing, but essentially the meat of the amendment is found in clause 2C of the bill, which seeks to insert two new subsections in section 6(1) of the Corporation Tax Act to exempt the profits of the National Investment Fund Holding Company Limited, that's one, and two, interest payable on bonds issued by the National Investment Fund Holding Company Limited. That is the extent of the amendment. As I indicated, the intention behind this amendment is to leave the fund, as I indicated, is intended to invest the dividend income that it receives, that it does not have to pay out in interest to its investors. It intends to invest those for the purpose of creating additional income to settle its liability as and when the bonds mature. And so we are seeking to leave with the fund all of the income that it earns so that it can maximize the return on its investment so that it can afford to pay out the liabilities as they become due, or it puts it in a better position to do that. And we are also seeking to enhance the return to the investor, though that essentially is the rationale for the amendments that we're seeking to make this afternoon. And I think that covers the gist of it. I don't think I have anything to add at this point. So, Madam President, with that, I thank you and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Corporation Tax Act, Chapter 7502, be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the Honourable Minister has advised that the matter before us is to create or establish a company which has already been established, and the bill that is before us seeks to amend the Corporation Tax Act in an effort to ensure that the company would receive exemptions on the payment of corporation tax on its profits, that is the National Investment Fund holding company, and also interest that would accrue and made payable on bonds would also be exempt. Madam President, you would be aware that the Minister did in fact alluded to this National Investment Fund holding company when he spoke in the 2018 budget. And he also made reference to that NIF when he also dealt with his midterm review. I'll have more to say as I proceed on the situation that we have found ourselves in as a country, where instead of doing whatever we can to return an institution that was born, bred, raised, grew, expanded, developed in our country by essentially locals of African descent. Mr. Cyril Dupree, Lawrence Dupree. It was one of the pride, it was a pride institution. That is CLICO and CL Financial. But as the Minister alluded, they got into some difficulty over leveraging, overreaching, and a lot of other matters that the Kuhlman report and commission dealt with, resulting in the company going cap in hand in 2009 to seek a government bailout. But I do not know what are the implications for what we are doing here today for future companies. Either, most importantly, indigenous companies who may find themselves in a similar situation in the future, and they come to a government for assistance, only to find that the government is now taking those very assets that ought to be in the control, under the control of CLICO and CL Financial, and having what is called a National Investment Fund established so you can raise what it calls the monies that are owed to it. Madam President, you know, I would like to ask the minister in the Ministry of Finance, what are the correct figures? What are the true numbers? How did you arrive at those numbers of $23 billion? I remember reading from a central bank report on the CLICO resolution plan back in 2015 that that institution called CLICO and its holding company, CL Financial, owed Trinidad and Tobago at the time $17.5 billion. And then all of a sudden, Madam President, we are being told by the government that has skyrocketed to $23 billion. And they have offered no real meaningful explanation for that sudden escalation in costs in terms of debt owed by this company. Madam President, one thing I can tell you is that under the CLICO resolution plan that we had established under the central bank, it was never the intention of the People's Partnership to liquidate the assets of CL Financial and CLICO and put it in what is called a national investment fund. It was, the idea was always, Madam President, to get the monies that were loaned to them, returned to the taxpayers of this country, and after a period of years, return CL Financial and CLICO to its owners. That was the intention. But, Madam President, what has happened is that we have liquidated a national treasury, a national prize, a national jewel that the citizens of this country built by their sweat, blood, and tears. So I would like, Madam President, when the Honorable Minister is winding up or concluding this debate later on this evening or tonight, that she would share with us what are the true figures that CLICO, CL Financial owe to the government and to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Is it what we had in the CLICO resolution plan, 17.5 billion, or is it what the Minister of Finance said, 23? Madam President, the government, as I said, announced this initiative in its 2018 budget, consolidated in its midterm review. And I have a document, a paper, it's a Sunday Express of Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018, and also Sunday, the 24th of June, 2018, respectively, in which there is an article, in fact, was a series, two-part series, on explaining government's NIF-backed bonds. And what is interesting here is that when the minister had presented his budget, he was looking at the whole issue of units. And as the minister said, they looked at several models. SIF model. There's another model, the issuance of shares, Madam President, to the public. And then they finally ended up with the third model, which is the issuance of bonds. But I would have liked to ask the minister, what was the rationale for dumping SIF? What was the rationale for dumping the issuance of shares to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago? And why did the government turn to option 3? Where, Madam President, as we are told, at the end of the exercise, where they are looking for budgetary support, and they are targeting $4 billion when they issue all these bonds in the 3 tranches that we have been advised, and the appropriate interest rates that the Honorable Minister have submitted to us today. When they would have finished with that $8 billion investment in the NIF, we would like to know from the Minister, Madam President, how much money would you have to collect from CL Financial thereafter? Because you got already 7, you now get almost about 10, 17, and you said you are owed 23. So you're going after 6 more. So when you collect those 6 more billions, what will happen? What are you going to do? Has the government, Madam President, worked out what is going to be the end game? Because I'm trying to understand the thinking of the government, the agenda of the government on these matters. Madam President, this fund is going to have a number of strategic CLICO assets placed into it. And Madam President, according to the article I am reading from, which is dated the 24th of June, in the Business Sunday Express, we are told in this article that NIF, or the National Investment Fund Holding Company, will have in it some 42.5 million shares of Republic Bank, which is valued at $4.3 billion. And my colleague, the Minister of Public Utilities, was a senior managing director of this institution, not only in Trinidad, but in Barbados and in Ghana, before he came back to do national duty in Trinidad. But you had to really abandon your citizenship before you took up duty. So, Madam President, here it is. We have 42.5 million shares, representing in value terms $4.3 billion. Then we go to something called One Caribbean Media, $15.3 million worth of shares. The equivalent, Madam President, in terms of ownership by the government of the Republic of TNT is 23%. So the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the cabinet of the PNM, now effectively owns 23% of the OCM, which is made up of the Trinidad Express and TV6. And why it is the government does not want to release those shares to the public of Trinidad and Tobago? Why it is the government wants to establish an NIF, Madam President, and to hold on to Republic Bank shares of 43%, no, 4.3. Madam President, do you know that the government of this country owns 51% of the shares of the Republic Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, or somewhere around there, close to 51%? But it's more than 50%. I understand. Maybe when Senator Lee Hunt speaks, he will advise me if my figures are wrong. Madam President, the other strategic asset, we are told, that will be placed into this NIF is the Angostura shares of 61.7 million, representing 29.9% of the rum and bitters producers' shares. So the government has almost 30% of those shares, Madam President. Whitco is about 4.5 million. Home construction, 19.5 million shares. So, Madam President, the question I am asking, and the government needs to clear, why go the route of the NIF when you have these sensitive organizations? Madam President, you know, the media is very important in our country. And we'd like to know from the government why it is you want to hold on and not release and liberate the shares of OCM and allow the citizens of this country and others to buy them so that you could free up the Trinidad Express and free up TV6 so they can do their work without an axe hanging over their head. What is the real intention? That's why I asked the question, is there a hidden agenda behind this NIF? Why is the government pursuing this NIF? And Madam President, we are told by the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Finance, at the end of the day, Madam President, when they would have collected $4 billion via the issuance of bonds in the tranches that we have identified, the government would get $4 billion for balance, for budgetary balance, because they have to deal with their deficit. Their deficit is about 10 billion or thereabout. They want to close that gap. So they expect to get 4 billion. It will bring it down to 6 or maybe 4. But you know, Madam President, at the end of the day, this NIF and all these strategic assets in the NIF will remain fully, totally, comprehensively controlled by the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And this is why, Madam President, we would like to have some clarification from the minister in the Ministry of Finance. You take control of Republic Bank, you take control of OCM, you're taking control of Angostura, Madam President, you're taking control of home construction, and then you have a new kid on the block. Just arrived from nowhere, out of space. TGU. And that is placed in the basket of strategic assets. So it now comes not 1-to-1 now, 2-to-1. Because remember, Madam President, the strategic assets translated into shares, which is the real base of the NIF, is valued at $8 billion. But the government is going to be extracting, according to the minister, through bonds, $4 billion. So it's 2-to-1. What is the hidden agenda of the government? So, Madam President, I ask these questions so that we can have some clarification from the government on this matter of CL Financial and CLICO, because for all intents and purposes, the government of the PNM has built a coffin and they have literally buried CL Financial and Clico. And we are performing the final rites today in this parliament with the formation of the NIF. That is what we are being called upon to do, Madam President, is to administer final rights on that institution. Because when the government places these assets, Madam President, into this fund, Madam President, they are now going to be investing either in 5-year bonds, 12-year bonds, or 20-year bonds. Madam President, the question that has to be asked is this. In an economy that is in deep recession, and all this artificiality and superficiality about turnaround, we know it's just it's a methodology that has been employed to mama guide the population. We know that. So, Madam President, we would like to know from the Honorable Minister, because I read somewhere, Moody's is predicting that $4 billion that the government is targeting as revenues for balance of for budgetary purposes, Madam President, may not be realized. So the question that has to be asked of the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Madam President, is if the $4 billion that the government is seeking to raise through bonds are not realized, what will the government do, Madam President? Because the government has to raise $4 billion for budgetary support. So we need to know, Madam President, if a shortfall arises or if market conditions becomes unstable, what will happen to these strategic assets that have been placed in NIF? Would the government have to go and put more of the assets of Clico or more of the assets of the Republic of TNT owned by the people of TNT into that fund in order to boost it, in order to stabilize it? We don't know. These are questions that we want or we would like to have some clarification on, Madam President. I want to also ask, Madam President, these bonds, which is a normal feature, government. Madam President, do you know that I must tell you that this is the third mutual fund investment instrument mechanism that we have established in our country? The Minister of Finance reminded us of the Clico Trust investment holding company, where 25% of Republic Bank shares are stashed away, and it's working well. There's another company, Madam President, called NEL, the National Enterprises Limited. And there's now a third company called NIF, NIF. And the question that has to be asked, Madam President, in terms of efficiency, is this an efficient use of resources in this country by having the state having the government, Madam President, establish 3 investment funds. Clico Trust Investment, holding company, the National Enterprises Limited, and now the National Investment Fund. I raised the issue about efficiency gains in terms of scarce resources in this particular context. And that is why, Madam President, you would recall, I had raised a matter on the motion for the adjournment on this issue of NEL and why we were creating another fund when there was already one in existence that we could have utilized and have what we are trying to do accomplished. But the government, Madam President, they know what they are doing, or so they believe. So we have to wait on them to see how this will pan out. So we have, I read in the papers this morning a very interesting article by one Ved Siriram on page 13 of today's Express. And he raised several issues surrounding this NIF plan. And I believe that the minister should look at this particular article and some of the issues that were raised are very interesting. I would like to ask the minister, Madam President, the government is fully backing this particular NIF to the fully. That is what we understand. There is a government guarantee, Madam President, in this particular exercise. And therefore, if there is a government guarantee in this exercise, Madam President, then there shouldn't be a problem in realizing the $4 billion. So the country would be somewhat taken aback if the government is unable to raise these monies. I read also, Madam President, where the Minister of Finance, in a newspaper article coming out from a debate elsewhere, where he said that this is a gift. The NIF is a gift to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to ask the Honorable Minister, in your allocation methodology, what percentage is being put aside for the ordinary person in this country? And given the state of the economy and the state of play in this country, Madam President, can ordinary people be in a position to meaningfully participate through purchases of these bonds? Or are these bonds going to be completely swallowed up and taken up by those persons who are in the insurance industry, in the banking industry, who hold pension plans, Madam President? Who will buy up these bonds? But we are told it's a gift to the nation. It's a gift to the people of the Republic. What people? Because who will eventually, Madam President, this is what the minister has to tell us, who will eventually purchase these bonds? The majority of these bonds will be taken up by the normal suspects on the compound. The normal suspects. And ordinary people will be a small percentage of that makeup So, Madam President, when they come and tell us that this is a mechanism to put the assets rather, of CLICO into the hands of the ordinary people of Trinidad and Tobago, I don't think the government is being real in terms of what is taking place in this country, Madam President. So these are matters that we believe that the government should be able to tell us more about. And when we talk about government, the government is raising $4 billion. But that money is not going to the people. The money is going to deal with government budgetary deficits. So it is not a people's arrangement. This is a revenue-raising mechanism that the government has thrown up in order to avoid it from going to international banks, the international capital markets, from borrowing from the domestic markets. It's a new way of getting money to continue its wastage and mismanagement of the people's resources in the country. But the only difference this time, they are going to the bankers, and I believe, Madam President, it may have been the bankers, it may have been them who called for more backup, and they were not prepared to go on a one-on-one arrangement, and hence the arrival on the compound of the TGU. And this is an area, Madam President, I would like the minister to clear for us. Why did you bring the TGU into this picture? Is it because of pressures that you got from those who wish to buy, and they found this whole enterprise to be very risky, Madam President? And in order to be attractive, you had to do what you did. So you have $8 billion in strategic assets in the NIF, but you are only going to be extracting, in revenue terms, $4 billion. We need to get some answers from the government on this, Madam President. Madam President, this is a very important matter. It is not as simple and straightforward as we have been advised by our friends on the other side. It's a matter in which the citizens and so on would like to have more clarification. For example, Madam President, my colleague, Senator Tahaka Ubika, has made a case on several occasions for the introduction of legislation to impose restrictions legally on beneficial owners or beneficial ownership. Because, Madam President, you don't have a lot of people fronting. They're fronting for others. And when you feel they're buying the shares, they're really buying the shares for somebody else. So when the government comes here, Madam President, in the absence of any legislation to restrict beneficial ownership, just remember, this government in June or April of this year, they approved a cabinet note to sell out 49.9% of our shares at TGU to their friends who the Prime Minister, when he was leader of the opposition, visited in Germany. That is on public record, Ferristal. So we want to know, Madam President, in the absence in the absence of any legislation to restrict, Madam President, beneficial
Senator Mark, you have 5
ownership.
more minutes.
How much more? Yeah. To restrict beneficial owners, how are we to ensure that we are not buying cat in bag? How are we good to ensure, Madam President, that the national interest will not be served? No, not today. Not today, Madam President. So I asked the Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance to come clean on this thing. What is the hidden agenda of the government behind the NIF? In the absence, Madam President, of legislation to safeguard the interests of the national interest, their friends and their families can put front men and front women to buy bonds on their behalf, and at the end of the day, Madam President, what happens? The ordinary people will not benefit from this exercise. Madam President, the final point I want to make with your leave. Where's the prospectus? Where is the prospectus? When will it be issued? When will it be issued so that the public can have an understanding? You understand you have a draft? You have a draft that you have sent to the Securities and Exchange Commission? But why did you table that draft here too, Madam President, so we could have an idea of what are the contents of the prospectus? So you are asking us to support a measure, and we don't have a clue of what the prospectus contains. How can you take us for granted, Madam President? This is putting the cart before the horse. So I asked the minister, could you provide this Parliament with a copy of the prospectus for the NIF? So, Madam President, in closing, I want the minister to tell us what is happening to no man's land in Tobago that Sandals was supposed to be located on. That is an asset that belongs to CLICO. That is a strategic asset. Where is no man's land today? Because Sandals, according to you, according to the government man, is no longer coming to Trinidad to build its own. The government of Trinidad and Tobago will be building for Sandals and then giving them a franchise to manage. That is what we are told. So where is the no man's land? Madam President, the government of this country, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, along with the Governor of the Central Bank, broke the law.
No, Senator No.
Okay.
Please rephrase.
All right. According to Section 44D of the Central Bank Act, when you have assets that are under your control, it must be under the control of the central bank to promote the interests of the policyholders, 100,000 of them, and not the interests of the government. And that is why, Madam President, I raised the question, how come the government was able to put their hands on no man's land without the governor of the central bank having a leading role when he was assigned the responsibility to protect the interests of the policyholders, and one of their strategic assets was no man's land? We need answers on this matter, Madam President. Madam President, how many seconds I have again? 55? Yes, Madam President. So I call on the Honorable Minister to come clean and to tell this country what is the agenda of the government behind this. I want to know why you want to put your hands on the Express.
Senator Mark, please rephrase. Two things you've just said there that I find unparliamentary. You've asked the minister to come clean and try and rephrase as you now have a few seconds left.
All right. To rephrase quickly, I asked the minister through you, why does the government want to put its hands in the Trinidad Express and TV6? I say hands off TV6 and hands off the Trinidad Express, Madam President. And we will not allow you to close down, as Synergy has been closed down, the Express. When I say so, the government. We will not allow the government. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Shriki Su.
Thank you, Madam President, for allowing me the opportunity to make a contribution to the bill before us here today. The bill before us is entitled An Act to Amend the Corporation Tax Act, Chapter 7502, where it proposes two clauses and two amendments, one being, I think, typographical some being typographical and two other subclauses being added to the bill. Clause 1 refers to the title of the bill, and Clause 2 amends the Corporation Tax Act in Section 6.1 by inserting two paragraphs, paragraph sub ZC and ZD. ZC to provide exemptions from the taxation of the profits of the NIF or National Investment Holding Company, and the ZD to exempt interest payable on bonds issued by the National Investment Fund Holding Company Limited will be exempted from taxation. So that there are two forms of exemptions being granted here. The first being on the profits of the company, and the second being on the interest payable by the instruments issued by the company. So that those are the two exemptions being sought. And in terms of the content of the bill, that's about the magnitude of the amendment with respect to the bill. So the bill is very short and very specific with what it intends to do. However, I think what is creating some element of concern here today is the nature of the fund and the way in which the fund is constructed and the way in which the instrument is being made available or being brought to market. So, Madam President, if you look at the way in which, with respect to having the Honourable Minister having piloted the bill, she gave a backdrop, the Honourable Minister gave a backdrop of how this will work. And this instrument has its genesis in the decline of the CL Group, where a significant amount of government funds was utilized to bail this company out, and now Trinidad and Tobago is seeking to recover its investment that it made earlier. So I would like to say, given the cash position of the government or the revenue stream of the government at this point in time, if there's a debt outstanding in my mind and there's a way to collect it to improve the cash flow position of the country, then I would support it. Because if it's any time Trinidad and Tobago needs a stronger income stream, it's now. And if this instrument is seeking to do that, then it has my certain attention with respect to it. However, I would like to issue one element of caution given the way in which the fund is seeking to be mobilized or brought to market. As Senator Mark was saying earlier, there has been a number of initial offerings to the market in the recent past. We've seen the FCB IPO, and I think that occurred in two tranches. We're seeing the NEL company, we saw the CIF shares, and now we're seeing a new company called NIF. And I'm raising just a concern here as to whether or not Trinidad and Tobago, the domestic market, has an appetite for this for raising this element of capital continuously in a very short space of time in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that's of concern because it seems to be that these instruments are just coming to market and the domestic economy is expected to absorb it. It's very quick, it's very fast, and we're seeing multiple instruments. And I think that's an area of concern to me, the rate at which these instruments are coming to market. Madam President, we've heard several numbers being thrown about with respect to the debt owed by CLICO. The Honourable Minister today used a number of 23 billion. I am in no position to comment on the accuracy of that figure, and I am going to accept the value being given to me. Sorry? 23 billion, yes, sorry. So I'm going to accept the value being given to me today. Of that 23 billion, it was told to us that approximately 7 billion has been collected over time from the operations of the assets, which leaves about 16 billion to be collected. With respect to the fund today, we're hearing about 8 billion coming from assets into this fund, but of that 8 billion, 2 billion belongs to TGU. So that leaves us with really 6 billion of assets belonging to CLICO. If 6 from 16 leaves us 10, then my question is, where would the next 10 come from? And that's another concern of mine with respect to, with respect to the bill. At this point in time, what we have is a fund that's being created that's called the NIF, where you have assets from these, from the CLICO assets being deposited into the fund, as well as the assets, as well as shareholdings from the TGU. The Honourable Minister gave a composition of the fund, and just to repeat, or just to indicate, to strengthen my presentation, she says Republic Bank would contribute about 55% of the fund, Whitco 5%, One Caribbean Media 2%, Angostura Holdings 12%, and TGU 26% to bring the entire composition of the fund, or the portfolio of the fund, of 100% over a diverse range. Now, the company that is going to be holding these funds, or where these assets are going to be resident, is referred to as NIF, the National Investment Fund. And so today we're being asked to amend this 7502 with respect to adding 2 forms of exemption for a company being referred to as NIF. And I want to join Senator Mark in saying, as a member of this House, I have an element of concern where I'm being asked to debate or to contribute to a piece of legislation concerning a company for which I really have no factual information about. What is the form of NIF? Is it a private limited company? Is it a public limited company? What is it? The minister may have not indicated such, and I'm sure she would be able to do so. But I would have liked to know the form or structure that NIF is taking. And in addition, has this form of investment, did it meet the requirements or the approvals of the Securities and Exchange Commission? Or what is the role of the Securities and Exchange Commission in bringing this instrument to market? Did we comply to their rules or guidance? And as Senator Mark raised a very important issue, the prospectus. I would have liked to know that at least the prospectus was available. Now, I'm understanding that you're on a timeline, and I'm understanding that you may not, that may be a confidential document at this time, but at least provide me with a little bit more details on the structure of NIF so I can feel a little bit more comfortable in giving my support to this bill. Because at this point in time, I really have no idea. So what is it am I really supporting? And the answer is I really can't say at this point in time. And that's a little concern of mine. So I would have preferred a little bit more credible information. And when I say credible, not via the minister, but not from the newspaper. I did not want to rely on secondary sources of information published in the media as the source of my information, because the accuracy of that leaves, can leave a lot to be desired. And I'm unsure. And so I would have preferred a little bit more sound information. Further, we've demonstrated that a lot of these assets are going to be deposited into the fund. We've spoken about Republic Bank, we've spoken about Whitco, we've spoken about OCM. And all of these companies are publicly traded companies. The $2 billion coming from TGU is also being deposited here. But I'm unsure of whether or not TGU has submitted its latest financial statements, what's the performance of its shares, anything like that. For the companies that are publicly listed, we can access their financials quite easily. But for a company like TGU, which really represents 25% of this fund, and having been being asked to contribute to it and then not having access to that information, I also think is a requirement for me to feel a little bit more comfortable, because I do not know what's the state of TGU, and I do not know what's the value of a TGU share. And it's 25% of the fund here. In addition, Madam President, I have read a lot about the CL debacle, and I've also noted that the assets could have been pledged to more than one creditors. And I'm a little bit concerned as to whether or not the assets chosen for this fund has the sole ownership by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Because I wouldn't like that we have created a fund and deposited a fund or composition of the fund is being or has a second claim to ownership. And I'll just ask for clarification with respect to whether or not the ownership of the fund, of the assets that is being deposited into the fund has been certified. In addition, Madam President, I listened to the Honourable Minister, and I thought a projected measure of performance of the NIF fund would have been nice, or would have been appreciated. How much is this fund expected to yield annually? What is the payback period with respect to the capital, as well as what is the funds, what was the value of the funds, or the interest, what is the value of that the fund would generate? Would it be able to offset the interest expense, and over what time would it be able to offset the capital being raised? I missed that bit of information, and I thought that that was critical to determine the veracity or the vigor of the fund. And those are critical for me, that I would have liked to know. Madam President, with respect to retained earnings, this bill, again, is seeking to exempt the NIF from corporation tax. We note that the income to be derived from the assets, which will form the revenue stream of NIF, is already tax exempt because it has been taxed by the source by its source, which would be the companies generating it. However, if NIF should undertake any element of investing activities or operations on its own, then it would be liable to corporation tax. And this amendment here today, ZC, in Clause 2, really exempts NIF from paying any element of corporation tax earned from its operations or investing activities. Now, given that it's exempted from corporation tax, my question is, if this fund performs well and is able to meet its interest obligations, as well as satisfy its or to repay the debt owed, or to repay the capital values of the bond being issued, and there is surplus revenue that this fund is generating through investing activities, then for what purpose would the surplus funds be used? If the fund generates a surplus and it generates a cash flow stream to the government, being the principal shareholder, after interest and capital repayments, and this sum is now exempt from corporation tax, which would actually have brought it into probably the consolidated fund for use, then for what use would these funds be put to? And then what's the policy with respect to surplus funds? Madam President, with the Honourable Minister, when I read this, when I read the bill, the issues of Green Fund levy and business levy did come to mind, and I thank the Honourable Minister for raising the issue and addressing it briefly, but it was very specific, and I thanked her for that, because the fund would be exempted from business levy if corporation tax is if they're being exempted from corporation tax, but Green Fund levy would have to be paid. So I thank the Minister for clarifying that issue in my mind. The second clause, or the second subsection of Clause 2, which refers to the interest payable from the instrument being sold, is saying that interest earned from this investment is also being tax exempted, or being exempted from taxation. Our Income Tax Act, in Clause 8.1 of the Income Tax Act, already exempts individuals from paying taxation on interest earned from bonds and similar investments. So this benefit is not specific to the individuals, or doesn't carry a benefit to individuals, because the Income Tax Act already covers that. With respect to corporation tax, however, corporations are not really beneficiaries of that tax exemption. So this clause really benefits the corporations. And as the Honourable Minister rightly said, and I found this to be a strength of this piece of legislation, in terms of making the investment tax-free, if you actually had to find an investment that gives you a 4.5% yield on the market after tax, you would have to be looking for an investment that would really yield you about 6.4%. So or if it was a 12-year bond, you would have to look for an investment of 8.14%. So while I commend the government initially on my first point for confronting this debt that is owed by CLECO, and I offer commendations to you, I also commend you with respect to offering an investment like this with such a high rate of return, because I'm not sure in the domestic market if an investment like this could be found anywhere else. And so I really commend you for making that investment available to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And while I commend this investment, and I thank you and I applaud your efforts for bringing it to market, I may have one or two concerns about it. So while I commend, I'm just raising a flag with respect to a concern or two concerns that I may have and ask that if it could be adequately addressed. The first point is Trinidad and Tobago's credit rating has been down for the past 3 years. It has been on the decline. Both Standards & Poor's and Moody's have demonstrated or have indicated a falling credit rating. And this is our international credit rating falling. And I did indicate in my budget presentation and mid-year review, with a declining credit rating over time, borrowing is going to be more expensive. And so what we're seeing here today is that while the credit rating is falling, we're issuing a domestic instrument where we're actually borrowing from the domestic market. The Honorable Minister indicated that this bond will carry its own credit rating from CARICRIS. But the Honorable Minister did not tell me what the credit rating was. And so I would like to know what the credit rating for this instrument is, especially in context that the international market is looking at Trinidad and Tobago and seeing a credit rating that's being provided by Standards & Poor's and Moody's. Here it is on our domestic market, we are raising an instrument for domestic borrowing, but I'm unsure of what the credit rating is. Is the credit rating of the bond, is it in any way aligned to Standards & Poor's and Moody's credit rating? And I'm unsure. So while I feel a little bit more comfortable knowing that a credit rating for the bond is being sought, what it is, I've not been told. And so I would like to know what the credit rating of the bond is, because the credit rating of the bond really demonstrates the attractiveness of the bond and the ability of the owner of the fund to service its obligations. The risk of the fund is really in the credit rating. What is the credit rating? And I'm unsure of what it is. Now, while I commended the government for having a higher rate of interest on this, I am saying because the credit rating is down and you need to attract a significant amount of investment, 4 billion, I do not think that this country has ever sought to borrow 4 billion from the domestic market at any one point in time. And so that by itself is a shock to Trinidad and Tobago. And now we do not know the credit rating of the bond. The credit rating of Trinidad and Tobago has been falling. And given now that we are trying to attract $4 billion of investment from an instrument that has in a country that has a falling credit rating or declining credit rating over time, then the interest rate has to be high. It has to be high. That's the only way in which we can attract the investors to the fund, because the risk profile, or what I would call the risk-free rate of Trinidad and Tobago, is on the rise. So in order for that $4 billion to be absorbed by an investor, the rate of return has to be attractive. And that's why it's pushing it in that direction. So while we say today that we are offering an investment of a high return, the question is, are we really offering it, or is it a requirement at this point in time in order for the $4 billion to be absorbed by investors? And that's my concern. So while we are positioning and marketing the fund as a high-yielding fund, is it really a requirement, or is it out of necessity that we're doing this to ensure that the $4 billion could be fully absorbed? And I'm unsure. I haven't been told that. Madam President, this $4 billion that's being sought by the NIF, while it's being positioned as an attractive investment, it is nothing short of domestic borrowing. And we can call it whatever we would like. We can claim whatever interest rate we would like. It is a form of domestic borrowing. And therefore, no matter what you see, no matter what is said and how it's presented, the government, being the principal shareholder of this company, with this $4 billion being sought, will increase the debt profile of Trinidad and Tobago. It may not increase net public sector debt because it's not being borrowed by the Trinidad and Tobago government, but is being sought after through an institution that is owned by the Trinidad and Tobago government. And therefore, the debt profile of Trinidad and Tobago automatically increases with this. $4 billion in addition to the net public sector debt. So, as an independent senator here, I've always been advocating or asking for a debt management strategy. And I would always say that I would like it detailed in the form of how are we going to address net public sector debt, contingent liabilities, debt incurred by state enterprises on their own balance sheets, government-to-government arrangements. And to that, I'm now going to add outstanding bonds of the NIF, because it has to be considered a debt of the country. It has to be, especially when the principal shareholder is the government. So this in its form here will increase the debt profile. How are we going to address this debt profile? And I remember before I was here, there was a comment being made by others, and I don't want to get into it, where the sale of the CLICO assets would be used to reduce debt. And today we're seeing the sale of the assets coming through the NIF being used for budget support. So the debt that was incurred in the past and should have been serviced by the sale of the assets, the debt profile remains the same, and the income is going to budget support. And I have another concern with that, because I do not believe that such a significant cash injection at any one point in time is going to be quickly realized in the near future. This may be this may be a unique opportunity for us to attract this form of investment or this form of cash flow at one given time. I do not know another instrument that can do that for us. And therefore, if we don't use it to address the debt profile, then we've just dug a hole for ourselves, a deeper hole. Madam President, I'm coming to the end of my presentation. So as I have addressed the issue with the debt profile, I would like to raise one more significant point with respect to the liquidity in the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The liquidity position in Trinidad and Tobago, meaning that available cash that we have at our disposal in the financial system, has been on the decline over the past years. If we follow the information presented by the monetary reports of Central Bank for 2017 and 2018, and if you allow me to quote from the 2018 figure report, it says here, over May to October 2017, this is excess liquidity measured by commercial banks' holdings of reserves at Central Bank in excess of statutory obligations decreased to a monthly average of 2.8 billion relative to an average of 4.1 billion. So we're seeing a decline in the liquidity in the financial system, moving from 4 billion in 2017 in May 2017 to 2.8 billion in October 2017. And if we follow the 2018 report, which gives us an update as at May 2018, April and May, that liquidity further fell to 2.1 and 2.2 billion respectively. So it's saying that the financial system is under a little bit of pressure as liquidity is being crowded out. And so, Madam President, this liquidity issue is also addressed in the form of interbank activity where banks are borrowing from each other. And liquidity levels over December 2017 to May 2018 led to a rise in interbank activity. That means commercial banks are trying to source funding to meet its daily operations from other banks. So the commercial banks are borrowing from other banks. And it's saying here it has reached 138.9 million, up from 117.7 million in May 2018. That figure was 104 million in October 2017. So liquidity here is being crowded out. Now, if we only have $2 billion here in the liquidity in the financial system or among the commercial banks, and we are trying to raise $4 billion, then what are we really doing with the liquidity position of the commercial banks and the financial system in Trinidad and Tobago? As we crowd liquidity out, it's going to be very difficult for private businesses to operate and to invest in the economy. So we need to be careful that while we are trying to fix one issue, that we are creating another issue simultaneously. And by crowding out private sector investment, we can actually be doing something worse than just trying to obtain revenue via $4 billion. I'm very much concerned about that. So that you have an increasing debt profile of Trinidad and Tobago. You have a liquidity position that's worsening. It has now reached about $2 billion, the lowest since about 2012. And now we're going to extract $4 billion out of this equation. How is that going to impact on us? Has any analysis been done? Are we able to assure Trinidad and Tobago, the citizens and the investing public and corporate Trinidad and Tobago, that we are mindful of what we are doing and give you the assurance, or give us the assurance that, hey, listen, bear with us, we know what we're about. And I haven't received that. And I'm very concerned about this, because this has the potential to bring significant negative implications to the financial system and the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. Its impact on GDP will show. So I issue a note of caution amidst falling liquidity or worsening liquidity position in Trinidad and Tobago. What we're trying to do is to extract more income from the economy, which will put us in an illiquid position. I really issue a note of caution with respect to that. So, Madam President, I promised not to be long today with respect to this bill before us, because it's just 2 clauses, and I don't want to utilize too much time given that the bill is very short. However, in recapping, I would like to say I commend, as I said earlier, I commend the government. You've confronted the CLICO issue, and you're trying to create a revenue stream to recover some of the revenue that the government of Trinidad and Tobago expended in the past. And I commend you for that, because if it's any time Trinidad and Tobago needs a stronger revenue position, it's now. The deficits have been too large, has been running away from us. 2017, the deficit was actually the largest deficit ever seen, probably in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. And an attempt to restrict that and to ensure that it doesn't happen again, we're looking at income sources and where we could derive it from. So I commend you for that. With respect to an instrument that's being offered at a higher interest rate, I commend you again for it. And I'm saying you're providing an opportunity for citizens and investors to yield a higher rate of return. However, I have raised some element of concerns with respect to the manner in which this is done. Now, I would like to say, with respect to the instrument being offered, I really cannot see or find a fault with respect to the instrument itself. A bond issue having 3 sections, a higher rate of return, and tax-free. I'm not seeing a problem with that. I have concerns with respect to the way in which it was brought about and the implications for the Trinidad and Tobago economy. With respect to the way in which this is done, what is NIF? How has it been structured? Has it been registered? And with respect to the instrument, has it had the approval of the SEC? And where is the prospectus for the fund? What is the proposed return on the fund? And is the return on the fund that's going to be generated, would it be sufficient to meet interest obligations as well as capital repayments? I did raise the issue of the $10 billion, and I calculated the $10 billion as $23 billion being owed by CLF or by the CL group, less the $7 billion that has been achieved, $16 billion, $6 billion of CLICO's assets in this fund, leaving a $10 billion deficit. How is the $10 billion going to be recovered? And I'm asking for an indication of whether or not government has the intention of holding on to the $3.9 billion investment in this fund. Is it that we're going to see at any point in time that $3.9 billion is now being offered for sale? I'm asking for clarity with respect to that. What is the credit rating of this bond, or that this company will attract? While I've heard that Caricris has been contracted to do so, to provide one, I have not been told what it is. And I'm concerned that given our decline in our international credit ratings, what this credit rating would be. And finally, Madam President, I have indicated that this fund and this bond issue is nothing short, while it's an attractive investment, is nothing short of domestic borrowing. This has the implication of increasing the debt profile of Trinidad and Tobago. While it does not directly increase the net public sector debt, it does increase the debt owed by the Trinidad and Tobago government, especially given the fact that the government of Trinidad and Tobago is the primary shareholder in this company. Given that it's increasing our domestic debt, I'm also saying that there's a liquidity situation that could be brought about, given that we have falling levels of liquidity, and we're now down to about $2.1 billion among the commercial banks. Commercial banks are borrowing from each other, even to the extent that one of them visited the central bank for funding from their repurchase agreement. And now we're trying to extract $4 billion additional from it. There will be an implication on the local economy. There will be an implication with respect to private sector investment. There will be an implication on interest rates, because central bank has been trying to hold on to interest rates by trying to manage it and keep it at a certain level. Here it is, we're bringing an instrument onto the market with the highest interest rate of an investment that will ever be seen or that has been seen in the recent past. What will happen? How come is it that central bank is trying to keep interest rates at a certain level, but government of Trinidad and Tobago is producing an investment with a high rate of interest? I'm confused as to why we're doing that. And not what will happen is that now competing in financial institutions will now bring to other investments to try to lure the limited liquidity in the system to them by offering interest rates, offering investments at higher interest rates to attract the funding their way. What will that do? That will increase interest rates. And the cost of borrowing will also go up because that has to be funded. Madam President, as I come to this, as I take my seat, I commend the government for its investment, its initiative, and its instrument. However, as a concerned citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, and as an independent senator, I'm concerned about the process by which this was being done and the implications on the Trinidad and Tobago economy. And I ask for these to be considered and probably addressed by other speakers. I thank you, Madam President.
Minister of Public Utilities.
Madam President, I once again am honored to stand before this House, this time in defense of a bill that seeks to secure the financial interests of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and more importantly, the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, the amendment that are brought before us now in this House relates to the corporation tax. It's a very simple, straightforward amendment, and it seeks to facilitate the exemption of the National Investment Fund Holding Company Limited from the payment of corporation tax on the profits from its interest payable on bonds from the company in the hands of bondholders in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, I have heard certain comments, and let me take some time to address some of the concerns that I've heard coming out from Senator Mark and Senator Torrell. Tricky-Soon. Regarding Senator Tricky-Soon, I mean, I hear what you're saying with regard to the possible impact, or I do not share your concerns as it relates to the possible impact as it relates to liquidity on this particular item. One, yes, I do acknowledge that present excess liquidity in the system is in the vicinity of about $2.8 billion. That's what my figures are saying. However, the money that is being brought in, the money that is being raised by this bond, it is all known that this money is going to be used to supplement government spending and to meet government's deficit. As a result, this money is not going to be sterilized. This money is going to find its way back into the system. So therefore, the impact of liquidity and interest rates and so forth that was being projected, I don't see that happening. In addition to that, in addition to the $2.8 billion, there's additionally over $10 billion in treasury bills that is also out there, that is short-term in nature. And I am confident that therefore the impact that you are talking about on interest rates will not result as a result, because the funds are not going to be sterilized. Finally, whether this will lead to other investors raising their interest rates on deposits, well, I think this is a $4 billion investment. It's a very close-ended, one-off transaction. And the reality is, if banks start to pay a little bit more money for interest other than the 0% and the 1% that they are presently paying depositors, and this spurs them on a little bit to do that, I am not going to object to that outcome. But I do not necessarily believe that this will have the benefit of an add-on effect on interest rates going forward. You know, Senator Mark made a comment and he said, you know, what is the implications of this to companies that find themselves in trouble or find themselves in problems like CL Financials and come to the government for assistance? And the reality, what I would like to say, this is very clear. The implications is when you borrow money or when the people, or when a government takes taxpayers' money and gives it to a company to help them through whatever financial problems that they are having, at the end of the day, we expect to get it back. It is not a gift. It is the people's money that was given. And in the case of this particular transaction, let us understand how we got here. We had a situation whereby we had money, we had cash. Cash is the lifeline of any business. And the people of Trinidad and Tobago gave the CL Financial assistance to the tune of $23 billion of our hard-earned money. This situation, as you heard, started way back in 2009. As I heard, as the Minister of Communications made mention in the other house, this matter went on and on. When the government changed, there was 15 extensions. 15 extensions to CL Financial, resulting in this matter and this money, this taxpayers' money being outstanding there for a very long time. When this government came into being, we started our measures to try to collect on this money that is outstanding. And as such, as part of the repayment for the money we got, we would have loved Senator Mark to be able to get back our cash. But after 9 years of waiting, we didn't get back cash. And what we got in exchange was some assets. We got some assets. We didn't ask for them. This is what we would have been able, so that we will be able to get back the people's money. So we got these assets. But assets, you know, as I told you, cash is like blood, blood of an economy. We can't eat assets. We need to get cash. So the government needed to find a mechanism of how do we monetize these assets? How do we turn some of these assets into cash? And really, this is where this particular transaction was born out of. We needed to get back the cash, which, by the way, is what we started with. We started with cash, and we want to end back with cash. So we got the assets. So what were the options that were available to us? Yes, we could have taken these assets and sell them. Yes, you could have sold them. Right? You sold the assets, and you would have gotten cash. Or we could have done what we are doing now and creating this particular instrument that allows us to get this cash. But let's talk a little bit about the first option. Because, you know, Senator Mark, when I heard your presentation, I went backward and forward about well, who has the money and what will happen, who will end up with the bonds, because limited people have the cash in the first place, etc., etc. So if we had gone the route of selling the assets, sell the assets. We recognize that these assets were strategic assets to the country. If we had sold the assets, what would have happened is that the assets would have then ended up, if I have to follow Senator Mark's conclusion, the assets themselves, and by extension, the ownership of these assets would have then fallen in the hands of the limited few that he is speaking about. And that in itself, and by the way, the opposition made a lot of points. They made a lot of acquisitions, saying that that is exactly what the government was intended to do. They were on record as saying that what the government plans to do with the assets of CLICO is to sell it to their friends. So one way I am hearing criticism as to what we propose to do under this structure, but then the other way I am also hearing whereby, well, you know, we want to keep the assets. We want to keep the assets and what we want to do with these assets, and like if there's some sort of sinister motive behind what the government is doing. So what did we choose to do? We decided in a very, I must say, innovative way, and I want to congratulate the Minister of Finance for that level of innovation. It was a fantastic idea. It was a fantastic read of the market. And clearly, the opposition, expecting that that is what we were going to do, just sell the assets, they're now wondering, well, what could I find wrong with this? What could I say? Because what we have done is decide to say, okay, let's create an instrument backed by these assets and leverage them and raise some funds, raise bonds on it. These bonds are not government guaranteed. They are fully backed by the assets. And because of the income that these assets generate, this income from these assets are the ones that are going to pay the principal and pay the interest on these bonds going forward. So government, from a perspective of increasing government's debt, there is no government guarantee, very clear. So we have created this instrument that allows that to happen. And why are we going down this road? Because, as Senator Mark mentioned, we have the CIF, we have the NIF, we have other avenues. We have NEL, which could have been options that were possible. But if you want to, what we did realize very early, based on the market forces, is that what the country wants, the country is concerned about two things. The country is concerned, or citizens, investors, are concerned about a return. They want to get an adequate and a secured rate of return. That is critical. And therefore, Senator Trikisoon mentioned about other instruments coming on the market. Yes, shares that came on the market from First Citizen. All right? That, again, is a share. That share could go up. That share could go down. That was not a secured rate of return, which is what the people of Trinidad and Tobago was. That's what the small investor could understand. He wants something that I know I am getting this rate of return. And therefore, when we did our market survey as to what investors are really looking for, and what investors are also looking for is asset preservation. You want to make sure that when you put your money, you're going to get it back. You don't want to buy a share today, and then the value drops for whatever reason, and when I want back my money and I sell it because I buy it at price A, and the price is now A minus, I now have lost my capital. And therefore, that becomes very important. So those are two considerations that we are always weighing in our mind as to what to do. Hence this innovative, fantastic product that solves all investors' problems. And I say innovative and fantastic because now investors have a chance of taking their money, all right? They could buy it in small amounts, up to $1,000, all right? And up to $1,000, you could invest in this particular instrument. And with it, you are getting a guaranteed rate of return. Guaranteed rate of return. You know exactly what you're going to be getting for the life of the investment. People like that. Secondly, you are also now going to look at the assets backing this bond. And what do you have? Because you want to make sure I'm going to get back my money. And these bonds are backed by One Caribbean, fantastic company, if I might say so there, so if I say so myself. All right? Republic Bank.
You might say so yourself.
I shouldn't say more. The name speaks for itself and the type of people that they produce. All right? Whitco. So you are talking about gilt-edged securities. If you have to buy a portfolio of investments on the stock market, those shares are the ones that you will buy. And therefore, you are almost then guaranteed by the assets that are backing the bonds, that your money will be, I mean, I will always, as a trained financial person, I always want to say everything is 100% secured. I wouldn't go down that road, but this is really as secure as you could get from a capital preservation perspective. So when you take all of these factors into consideration, as I said, this is a fantastic return, and it's a fantastic, so let's spend a little time and talk about the return. Now, again, there is the concept, you know, there is a saying, damn if you do, damn if you don't. We have decided that, listen, this is the people's money, all right? Let us create an instrument that gives people a fantastic rate of return because we're giving back to the people. And therefore, we created an instrument and we give different time frames for different investors in different investment horizons. So you have a short-term investment, 5 years. You have a long-term investment for looking at people with that investment horizon as far as 20 years. And you have something in the middle. So we have tried to cater for all in this particular environment. In addition to that, what this amendment is attempting to do here, we have gone the route of making this investment, the return, making the income on this investment tax-free in the hands of the people who get them, the bondholders. And that has resulted, that one stroke of brilliance by the Minister of Finance, if I might dare say myself, has made this investment even more attractive. And why? When you look at what is presently, what are the alternatives? When you're trying to look at the attractiveness of investments, you ask, what is the next best alternative? Well, in the case of individuals who wants to be on the shorter end, all right, you are presently going to be getting 4.5% return. 4.5%. What is your next best alternative? Your next best alternative right now is to leave your money in the banks, and you're leaving your money in Republic Bank. By the way, this fund is backed by 55% of the same Republic Bank assets that you're talking about. But when you leave your money in Republic Bank, you will only get what we're getting now, 0.5%, 1% at best, as a return. In addition to that, if you have a mere, we all know, if you have a mere $1,000, all right, you will get basically 0.25%. And if you have $1 million, right, then you might get closer to the 0.75%. In this regard, if you have a mere $1,000 and you buy your bond, you're getting 4.5%. All right? If you want to buy more, you're getting 4.5%. So therefore, you talk about something to help the small man. Again, as always, this government is always interested. You see, we are always interested about the small man in everything that we do. We don't just talk it. We put it into action in every single thing that we do. So again, so from an alternative investment for an individual, it is very attractive. Now let's go to corporations. Again, by virtue of what we are being asked upon here to do about the tax exemption, and that's again, Madam President, trying to relate it back to the bill, the tax amendment, all right? What is going to happen is that you are now going to have a rate, the more medium to long-term investments, 12 years, at 5.7% for a bank who has liquidity and wants to invest in this. The effective rate of that investment for a bank who is presently paying 35% tax is that they're going to get an effective rate of 8.76%. And for the 20-year investment, 10.2%. Now, let me again show you some of the equivalents of why that is so attractive. Because a bank presently has cash, and what does a bank do with it? A bank makes money by lending it out to other customers. If a bank wants to lend money right now to a good corporate person, the person will probably get a return of about 7%. They get a rate of about 7%, and then that income at 7% interest is taxed. So what they're in effect getting is a lot less than 7%, because again, 7% is before tax. Right now, a bank in its long term, they lend money to mortgages. The mortgage portfolio. A mortgage portfolio in a bank is probably about 5%. So again, you give money long term and you have 5%. That's a return. Compare that now to, as I said, the after-tax return on this is going to be close to over 10% on the long end. So at the end of the day, this is an attractive investment for the small man, and it's also an attractive investment for the banks and for the institutional investors. In addition to that, what this market has been starved of over the years is really long-term investments giving an appropriate returns for your pension funds. The type of return that you need in a pension fund for a long-term investment is a rate of return on an instrument gives you over 5%, because the actuaries work out potential inflation, etc., etc. And they are looking for instruments that are over 5%. And if you speak to anyone managing pension funds, they will tell you that they are starved for investment opportunities. There are very limited amount of investment opportunities, especially in this market, and those pension funds are also restricted by the fact that they can't take their funds and invest it overseas. Only a percentage of that money could find its investment overseas. So what you're finding is that a number of pension funds have to then take their money and put them into T-bills at very small rates of interest. And by virtue of those pension funds not being able to make the required rate of return, they are also then asking people to increase their contributions because they're not being able to make the investment income that they expect. Again, this particular instrument allows, it's like gold to the pension funds because it gives them a long-term investment. And granted, they might not be the ones because they don't pay taxes, all right? But they are getting an investment that is going to be giving them a return of 6.6%. That is 160 basis points above what it is they need to be able to meet the actuarial requirements. Again, a very attractive investment for them. So when you look at this investment, so this tax that the amendments that we are asking to pass here is going to make this investment very attractive. And therefore, based on the market researches that we have done, we are confident that our ability, and yes, recognizing that we have not seen in the market an instrument raising as much as $4 billion, but I could tell you there's never been in this market an instrument like this particular fund and like this one created by that innovative Minister of Finance. And therefore, we are confident, therefore, that because of the innovative nature of this particular investment, that the money that is being called upon to raise, that it will happen. I dare say that the approach that is being put forward by this fund, by it being an asset-backed fund using income on or using shares that are traded in the stock market and against a bond and mitigating against fluctuations and giving you a rate of return, basically, this is really the first time that an instrument of this nature, very common throughout in other developed countries, very common, but there hasn't been anyone like this in this market. And therefore, I am also sure that what will come out of this particular structure is, again, some more innovation and creativity to our very thin capital markets. So, once again, another benefit of this particular structure, bringing at least innovation and diversification to what long-term investors have as an option. Madam President, there is no secret that this government, or one of the reasons for raising this bond, is because it is going to be used to help the government finance its deficit. The money is not coming to individuals. It is going to be used to help finance this government's deficit. And that is fine, but I don't want to go too much there. But as I delve into that, because yes, people wanted to know what is this going to be used for. We have to understand that the fact that we have reached in this country where 4 billion is about all we need to help close the gap between income and expenditure is something that we should be jumping and feeling very proud of, and again commending the Minister of Finance for his astute management of this economy to reach to the point that we only need 4 million and a little bit more to bring this country back into a balanced situation. You have to understand, people seem to not or forget where we came from. Where we came from a situation. We came from a situation, don't forget, because as I told you, my African proverb, to forget is to throw away. And at the end of the day, we must always remember, we came from a situation with an expenditure of $63 billion at a time when our income has fallen to close to 37 billion. Right? You are talking there of close to $26 billion in deficit. That is what it is that we had to manage. So you have managed a 27 billion deficit to come down, where we have to do this to raise 4 and a little bit in some other means. That is a fantastic feat. You know, I heard my Prime Minister talk last week, Friday, and when asked a question based on what he saw, what was happening in Barbados. Question was asked to him, based on what is going on in Barbados, what is going to happen to Trinidad and Tobago? All right? Are we going to the IMF? And he proudly said, that is not where we are going. And you know why that is so? That is so because we are not going to the IMF, and we could stand here now and say we are not going to the IMF because we have been able, under the astute management of this Minister of Finance and a People's National Movement government, to reduce that deficit from the 26 billion that it was to now where we only need to make this 4 billion plus a little bit more and we should be all right. We have brought expenditure down, as was said in the mid-year review. We are now looking at an expenditure of close to about 48 billion. And we're now able to get income coming up. to about 40, a little bit over 40 million. So therefore, we have closed that gap significantly. What I could assure you, Madam President, is if it wasn't for that type of astute management by the People's National Movement, where we were before, if we had continued with that type of $63 billion type of expenditure which we got no value for, you would have then ended up where we were on a slippery road based on what we inherited and what was left for us to manage in an economy that was heading head-on speed towards the IMF. That is what we inherited. And it's that type of reckless spending and that type of over-expenditure is what gets you there. I lived in Barbados. I am aware of how beautiful that country was when it managed its affairs. And I have seen what successive governments were able to do. And as a result of the actions taken by them, where that country has reached. And I'm saying, we take for granted the fact, and we sit here and we talk about, well, we are now in a position where we could say what we are saying and be proud about it, that we are not going there. But that didn't happen like that. That happened as a result of prudent action. The fact that we were able to get some of these assets back and be in a position to monetize them now is because of the actions, again, not just old talk. It is because of the decisions and the hard decisions that this government was prepared to take for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Nobody else. No one else. We take all these actions for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And you know why we do that? Because it is the right thing to do. So we got here, Madam President, by a number of deliberate actions, dealing with a number of things all at once. This particular CLICO matter, which was laboring there, outstanding there, is how much time did I say? 15 times? 15 times this thing was extended and extended and extended because no one wants to act. It's the same situation that happened with regard to the oil sector. All right? A lot of the things were left there, the contracts were left there. Minister, no one wants to act.
Minister, if I could just intervene and ask you to, you're starting to stray a little bit from the remit of the matter before us. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you, Madam President, for the guidance. But so I turn the corner and I come back immediately. All right? Yes, this is, we are here today to talk about this particular instrument. All right? The genesis of this instrument, and we are able in a position to even be able to speak about it and have assets that we want to monetize is because of the actions and the prudent actions of this particular government. Check. The instruments that were created, all the fears of a few people getting these assets, or these assets falling in the hands, on these strategic assets falling in the hands of a few individuals, that will not happen. The assets are placed now at the end of this bond. When it is issued, it is going to be in the hands of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, the government, and by extension, the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Check. The particular structure, as Senator Tricky soon mentioned, there is no argument. It is a fantastic structure. It gives you adequate returns, and it gives you the protection of your assets. So put another check. This is, again, a fantastic instrument. And if I could quote, if I could take the opportunity to quote a statement made by the president of the Bankers Association, Mr. Nigel Batiste, in a recent article, when he was commenting, when he heard about the NIF, his comments on it was a positive development from a national perspective. and said that it gives all a chance to share in the wealth.
Through you, Madam President, just a quick question. And I think it's a great idea, but as with Senator Shriki Soon and others, could you just share the mechanisms by which the government will ensure that, as you indicated, the shares are able to be optioned by the widest possible cadre of the society and not proxies acting on behalf of others, so that your indication a while ago will come to pass? What mechanisms are in place to ensure that, if you can, or the Minister when she's wrapping up?
Well, I'm sure the Minister will elaborate, but let me first say, the Minister will elaborate, but I will also help. I will also let you know. First to begin, we are talking here about bonds and not shares. That's an important deliberation. And therefore, it does, at the end of the day, the shares for these companies are not going anywhere. They are going to remain in the hands of the government and the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, whether or not there are $4 billion worth of bonds, right? I am almost positive that anyone who wants these bonds are going to be able to get them. I mean, there are concerns people have been raising on whether or not we could raise $4 billion, right? But even if, what I'm saying, even if, right, I am sure there are going to be mechanisms, if they are oversubscribed. I am not fully 100% aware, and I'm sure we will be able to tell you, if they are oversubscribed, how we are going to do the allocations. But in this case, remember, you are raising money from individuals. Even if more than one individual gets the bond or buys more of the bond than is required, at the end of the day, he does not have the rights and the ownership.
Minister, you have 5 minutes remaining.
He doesn't have the rights and the ownership of the shares. So he will benefit from the higher return, I agree. He will benefit, and we will like a lot of the population to benefit. But it is not like the first citizens, when the person got shares and therefore got actual ownership rights to go and vote and make decisions and change the board of directors of the companies. That ability is not going to be offered to bondholders. So that part, again, the actual mechanism to ensure that oversubscription would be in place, I am sure that the Minister will be able to elaborate in her closing up requirements. So, Madam President, a fantastic instrument, a very innovative instrument. And before I close, there was one particular, I heard a comment in another place, where one was mentioning about why are we bringing, or why are we putting into this, one of the crown jewels, TGU. And my only comment on that is, well, why not? If it's a crown jewel, and it is owned by the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and the returns of that crown jewel via giving people a return on a bond, an attractive bond, could be given back to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, I have no objection. So if we are being accused of that, of taking our crown jewels and giving back the benefit of our crown jewels to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, again, it shows the type of government that you have. Another fantastic idea. So, Madam President, this, again, in closing, it's a fantastic instrument. It allows for the government innovatively to be able to manage some strategic assets and not pass them out and not give them out to a lot of other individuals. It allows for the returns to be very attractive, and therefore I ask all of my colleagues in this House to let's put aside all of whatever differences that we may have, all right, and let's support something that is good for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And if in so doing, by supporting this particular amendment that makes an already good instrument better, we are doing work, we are doing that. So I so move, I thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Madam President, for acknowledging me as I contribute to this bill after the Freudian slip from the Minister of Public Utilities.
want to go there bad.
I didn't say Minister of Finance as yet. Now, I want to correct the record, Madam President, because the first statistic that I'm sure the media will pick up is 4 billion deficit. But really and truly, even the Minister of Finance, unfortunately, agrees with me when the deficit is $10 billion. So please, let's correct the record. Now, and to ensure that persons on the opposite side don't think I'm misrepresenting the Honorable Minister of Finance, Madam President, permit me to quote the Honorable Minister himself when he spoke on Monday this week regarding this same bill. And I may say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from the Hansard, as time goes by and as other assets become available, if these are high value, high income, no, sorry, I'm making a mistake. This $4 billion from this National Investment Fund, these bonds will go a long way to dealing with that $10 billion deficit. So that puts this notion of a $4 billion deficit to rest. Now, so this is the Minister of Finance on the Hansard. And he continues, we are still expectant that our fiscal deficit will be in order of $4 billion. So he's wishing. That's wishful thinking or wishing economics. So we expect to get $4 billion in capital revenue from the National Investment Fund, company, asset-backed bonds, and another $2 billion from other sources, dividends from state enterprises, and so on.
If I could just make an intervention here, please. You are quoting from the Hansard from the other place. Now, that is, you can do that, but the quotes must not be lengthy, and then you must then incorporate it into your presentation. So, you understand what I'm saying? So trying to not be quoting as extensively as you are.
Thank you, Madam President, but that actually was the full stop from the quote. Now, what I want to continue by stating that this begs the question, where this $2 billion will come from. Because the Minister of Finance speaks of $4 billion, and then, which we know as he hopes to get from this NIF, and $2 billion from other sources. But in the same presentation, Madam President, the Minister of Finance went on, and he said regarding the other assets that they are looking at, that they are eyeballing to see if they can capitalize on to bridge the gap with expenditure, not to diversify, not to develop the economy. And as other assets become available, if these are high value, high income yielding assets in stable companies, we may give consideration in future. For example, there's a company called Methanol Holdings International, which the shares in that company are owned by Colonial Life. Madam President, if we are to be guided by the thinking of the Minister of Finance, then one can only presume that there's a big question that we have to ask, in that this whole recipe that was cooked on the say-so of some institutional investors who are taxing us, the citizens, hard to pay the difference to them in these bonds, meaning they want to balance their books because the government has raised taxes from 25% when we left office to 35% in the case of commercial banks, and they want to get back their pound of flesh. And the pound of flesh is the people's $4 billion. Because we, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, Madam President, are being asked to sacrifice for as long as, in some instances, 20 years, the Crown Jewel, TGU, Republic Bank, and the other assets that were taken by virtue of the CLICO fallout. Madam President, with no prospectus, with not even the respect of a bond memorandum. That, to me, Madam President, is untenable and unacceptable in this modern age. Now, Madam President, I want to continue to shed light wherever there may be darkness on the presentations by the honorable ministers who preceded me. Now, in referring to liquidity, we know that the liquidity, given the report of the central bank, the monetary policy report for 2018, which they looked at the first 5 months of 2018, stating that liquidity is at just over $2.6 billion. So it's not a great situation because we are accustomed with liquidity levels being around $3.5 billion
approaching $4 billion. So, but the Honorable Minister who preceded indicated, Madam President, that there will be no impact because the use of these funds are not for sterilization purposes. And for the layman who is not a finance person, that is to say that they are not being used just to mop up excess liquidity and take it out of the system so that there is not too much money chasing too few goods. What, in effect, he is saying is that because the government will be spending this money on recurring expenditure, it will find its way back in the system. However, because we have no prospectus, no memorandum, no indication as to what exactly will be the expected timeline, because if we have all information, we can make our own assessment as to whether or not this entire bond issue will be successful in the time frame prescribed or not. Therefore, we may well find that the liquidity, the non-issue, may actually become an issue because there may be some challenges with the money working its way back into the system, and by working its way, we mean via the appropriation bill and releases from the Ministry of Finance. So I put that one to rest. Now, another point raised by the Honorable Minister, it regards the issue of investors, and a market survey was done. I want to ask the question, how wide was this market survey done? And was it done over drinks at West Moorings, or was it really done with a wide cross-section of the, will it be done with a wide cross-section of the people? Or was the prior survey that informed the decision-making regarding the interest rates will be the substantive issue at hand? And I will get to the interest rates because we have a yield curve at the central bank for Trinidad and Tobago, and I want to get to that. However, I really need to get into my presentation, but the Honourable Minister made so many points that require me to clarify for the public regarding the national interest, Madam President. Now, what I want to also say is that what we have here is really and truly, for all intents and purposes, to put it in simple language, the government is borrowing $4 billion from the people of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as other investors, because the Honourable Ministers preceded spoke mainly of investors, not people. So one has to assume that their target market is really institutional investors. Now, big companies, okay? So what we really want to look at is, let's start with the issue of the NIF itself. Now, the Honourable Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Madam President, there's so much things I have to say. I don't think 40 minutes will be enough for me, but I will try to get through the key points that I have. So, Madam President, now, the Honourable Minister of Finance, in piloting the bill, made some comments regarding the Green Fund and Business Levy. And if you read the Honourable Minister's contribution, Madam President, in the other place, you would get the sense that, and I just want to quote one line, the dividend income received by the NIF will be subject to the Green Fund levy. And also, right, so the Green Fund levy. He said he ruled out he ruled out any other levy, so the Green Fund levy. Now, he also said it may also be subject to the business levy, but I'm not certain about that. However, when I listen to the Honourable Minister in the Ministry of Finance, and I stand to be corrected, the Honourable Minister in the ministry stated that it will not be susceptible to the Green Fund. So, it will be susceptible. Not business levy, okay, so my apologies. So they are in one accord in that regard. So we know that it will be susceptible to the Green Fund, but not business levy. Okay. So let's go forward, Madam President. I thank the Honourable Minister for that clarification. Now, let's look at exemption from profits tax regarding dividends and so on. Now, there are persons to come after. So all I will say is this whole issue of exemption of profit tax, of the income from tax, income from interest from tax, begs many questions as to whom are we trying to woo and who are we trying to target. I will delve no further so that the members on this side coming after will not run afoul of the standing order regarding tedious repetition, Madam President. Now, I want to give another response for the public record regarding the Honorable Minister of Finance in the other place. Now, the Honorable Minister of Finance...
Senator Obika, let me just point out to you. You can make reference to the Hansard of the other place. What you cannot do is debate the speakers in the other place. You understand? You can make a reference, but you can't be doing as if you're debating that particular statement in the other place. Okay? So try and understand what I'm saying and try and now make your presentation accordingly.
Thank you very much. I was hoping the minister would have come, but okay. So I will phrase my language accordingly. Now, effectively, what we have done as a responsible opposition, Madam President, as the guardians of democracy, is alerted the people of Trinidad and Tobago to a plot to sell TGU to Ferrostyle, and as a result of that, the government had no choice but to backpedal, to rescind,
Public pressure.
and to cease and desist from that line of action.
UNC pressure.
Now, Madam President, for those persons who are students of the social sciences, and in particular economics and finance, they would know that a government bond is an instrument used by governments to borrow money. All right? So let's be very clear here. If we are to debate the merits and principles of this proposed bill, all right, which we have the parent legislation, it's very voluminous, but we are only seeking to change two small parts, one the title and another part regarding the exemptions. But if we are to look at if we are to be debating the merits and principles of this bill, one must get into the whole concept of how do you communicate and articulate to the people. Now, if anyone ventures onto the Securities and Exchange Commission of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on their website, and they do appropriate searches, they would find guidelines for prospectus. Now, while this is a bond, you may find that the terminology may be different, but the essence will be the same. So I want to stick a pin on the guidelines for the prospectus. And I want to speak to the difference between, as we are speaking on the merits and principles, the difference between bonds and shareholding, because it seems that persons are confused, because I'm hearing persons saying selling and the company and that type of thing. But in effect, there are two totally different principles here, at play here. What you have is, and I have to break it down in as simple language as I can, so pardon me, Madam President, if I am taking my time to find the words, because I don't want to be too technical. Okay? Now, what we have is, I will never be relevant on matters of finance. Yes. To the Honorable Minister of Agriculture, yes. Through you, Madam President. Now, what we have, Madam President, is persons will be lending the government through a vehicle in the name of the National Investment Fund Holding Company Limited. And this vehicle will be holding shares of varying percentages, of which I have here and I wish to share, of varying percentages: 26% Republic Bank, 23% OCM, 29 to 30% Angostura, 5-point-something% Whitco, to that level, that type of thing. No, sorry, not Whitco, the actual percentage quoted. Now, so you don't have a controlling stake, okay? So you are lending money to a state agency, newly created, of which you don't know anything regarding the operations. I'll leave that for persons to come after, as I want to stick to the core principles of the transaction. And this entity is, their stock and trade are entities of which they have no control over, Madam President, of which there is no plan for control over in the near or the distant future, Madam President. So therefore, what you have really and truly is a situation of great risk, which must be quantified for the public's interest. And it gives me great displeasure to be, because I enjoy reading financial statements. To me, that is the most beautiful literature for me. However, it gives me no pleasure, Madam President, to say that we do not have the information at hand to make a decision. Yes, you can venture and get the information through your own means, but really and truly, that should have been placed before us in the package with this bill. However, notwithstanding that it has been done in that regard, so this point that I'm raising would have been made clear to all persons involved had they seen the financial statements, seen the controlling interest, the related parties, etc. So you are making an investment in an entity of which you have no control, because not an investment, so you are lending an entity whose stock and trade are businesses of which they have no control over. So what is to say, Madam President, that the government may decide in future they may have a good opportunity, a better opportunity than this, to sell the remaining stake in Republic Bank to another investor. And the ownership of Republic Bank changes. Republic Financial Holdings Company Limited, which is the parent company of Republic Bank Global, based in Port of Spain. Now, suppose that happens. Then you could be left holding the raw end of the stick, Madam President. You could take your life savings if you are a public servant. You get your $100,000 to $300,000 gratuity after you've made it to the 30 years, and you've put it in. You've encouraged your children to so do, and when you wake up one morning to realize that the shareholding of 55% of the assets vested in the NIF in a company that has changed its shareholding, its ownership, and now you are left ruining the day you made that investment. Madam President, I hear the Honorable Minister of Trade saying I'm pessimistic. But, okay, I raise that point to say this. My stock in trade is risk analysis. My stock in trade is not necessarily being pessimistic, but being critical. Being critical of financial decision making. So, Madam President, I wish to continue. There's so much to say, but I have to watch the time. Now I want to move on to the purpose. The purpose of this, which should again have been in front of us, because we can debate it. And as I go to purpose, before I give my understanding of what is the purpose of what we are doing here today, I want to go to continue reading parts, not the entire thing, it's a short, sorry, I can't brandish, a short bullet point thing regarding the contents, just a summary of the contents of our prospectus from the Securities Exchange Commission. And this short paragraph states, a prospectus shall contain such information as investors and their professional advisors would reasonably require. I would wish to add that individuals, but okay. And reasonably expect to find there for the purpose of making an informed assessment of the following. A, the financial position, assets and liabilities, profits and losses, and prospects of the issue of the securities. Madam President, if I were to speak on this line item alone, I could take us until tomorrow regarding these companies under the NIF. I will not do so because I don't have the time. The other point is the rights attaching to those securities. And the last point is the merits of investing in the securities and the extent of the risk involved in so doing. Madam President, if we have a Whitco, for example, if we had to say the merits, and someone, let's say, is not interested in investing in particular types of organizations, all right? Because I have to come here to the way you include citizens when persons make investment decisions. That is the next point after the purpose. If you have to include persons, Madam President, you must understand what would be their motivations to invest or to remove themselves from particular types of investments. For example, some persons will not be associated with alcohol because of their personal ethics. As a result of that, you want to ensure that all persons who are lending monies understand what the underlying assets, what are their stock in trade. That is an ethical argument, but it's an argument that finds its way, from my interpretation, on the prospectus guidelines of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So now, Madam President, let's move on to my understanding of the purpose for this. And I want to put it in one line: a panacea for the fiscal deficit. That $10 billion that the government is dreaming down to $4 billion, I say dreaming down because we have not seen the pragmatic approach. This NIF is the first step in that. Now, however, I want to say this, that what we are doing, and I said it before, and the Honorable Minister of Public Utilities, in the Honorable Minister's presentation, mentioned the fact that we said on this side that by selling the CLICO subsidiaries, you are selling away the patrimony of the people. And because they are not, in this instance, for these few companies, they are not selling, that we don't know how to couch our arguments. I'm saying, Madam President, that the argument is the same. And here is why. Because what you are in effect doing is tying up $8 billion in blue chip assets for 20 years in the longest instance for $4 billion today. This $4 billion will be spent today. The interest income accrued to the government will be sent into a sinking fund, which will be used to repay those bonds upon maturity.
20 years after 20.
That, Madam President, that process will take a total of 20 years. So what you are doing is you are tying up for 20 years $8 billion in these companies, which really and truly could have been used, could have been put to better use. That $4 billion could have been put to revenue-creating uses. But we know for this government, diversification is on paper, but in practice, we find challenges to see any plan for diversification. So, Madam President, I want to address the myth about including citizens, all right, in this proposal. Now, the Honorable Minister said that this plan is for the people. However, that was only at the tail end of the presentation. Throughout, it was about the investors. And that is big business, okay? Now, we would want to, of course, use creative language to say that when I put $1,000 in my credit union, I'm an investor, you know, but however, we know that it's not me we are speaking of. So, Madam President, the core principles of this bill speaks to how one chooses to use the resources of a country to govern and to develop for its citizens. We in the United National Congress have espoused and believe in a shareholding democracy. Meaning that the people of Trinidad and Tobago should own the commanding heights of the economy and have the cake, not the crumbs that fall. What is proposed here has nothing to do with shareholding. It is actually the government borrowing money, using the people's $8 billion. It is our $8 billion that is there in those companies. And it will find its way to, in the main, without restrictions, as there have been no proposed restrictions for this, to protect the small man so you can get a percentage. I wouldn't go further because persons will go beyond on that. So the point I want to make is that this really speaks specifically to we giving up our $8 billion so that the investors could have access to $4 billion in terms of the returns over a period of time. The government will be lending, will be taking that $4 billion and generating returns for those people on the backs of our $8 billion. I find serious problems with that. Now, Madam President, if you have to look at protecting the public's interest, you would want to understand how individuals, families make decisions to invest. Because that is what this whole bill today seeks to address. On one side, apart from government revenue shortfall on the other. Risk tolerance, the risk profile of persons, and the goals persons have. Many persons may not be able to hold for long term. They may wish to hold for shorter term. They may wish a flexible type investment. And I understand that there are no penalties for selling bonds, for disposing of bonds. I don't know if the Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance could clarify if I am correct in my assumption. If that be so, so be it. So let's go on to justifying participation outright and the quantum of investment. All right? Now, why these companies? Why not other companies? Senator Mark spoke about One Caribbean Media. I won't need to add my voice to that. But there are other companies that would have been seized by the government. Why not those companies? Why not use this opportunity, Madam President, to inform the population as to whether or not those companies in particular, even if by way of an annex, have been making their contributions to the consolidated fund, to the state? This, to me, would have been an ideal opportunity for the Minister of Finance, the Honorable Minister, to educate the country as to what is the status regarding the repayment from the CLICO issues. Now, there's one issue that was alluded to regarding the size of the returns and the paucity of information on the underlying assets. Yes, we know that they are traded. However, once you make a loan, once you offer a loan, a key component is the controlling stake as a going concern. So whilst the returns may sound great now, we want to ensure that those returns don't, and the NIF does not become, by virtue of its rosy returns, a charge on the state. Because if you have a 5-year horizon and the returns become a charge on the state because the companies may have some challenges, how can you then adjust? I want to give a short explanation of that. For example, one may have an institution that gives bonds of a similar nature, but they may not call it bonds, but is backed by similar underlying assets of companies and their performance. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we have many companies that purchase these through different means. There's a company in St. James, I won't call the name because it's not relevant to this today, that's their stock and trade. So you may have a contractor, they have an existing contract with the HEC, a receivable due, and the company would change this receivable and re-engineer it into a bond for all intents and purposes, and resell this to smaller financial institutions, etc., who have excess liquidity. However, those are much shorter time horizons. So if the company's performance is somewhat challenged, I don't want to call the name of the company. I don't want to call the name of the company, so that's why, Madam President, I'm being accused of being too technical. So I will try to be more simple in my language. Effectively, no, this is my stock and trade. So effectively, Madam President.
Oh, I try to allow the crosstalk a little bit, but it's interfering with the debate. So, Senator Bika, continue, please.
Thank you, Madam President. But I really would like to know that I'm reaching persons, because if I can't reach persons here, I know I won't reach anyone outside of these halls. So let me go over in a as short as I can. Effectively, and just stick to this bond in particular, the government will not be able to come back to the market and say, here's what, the companies that we are holding shares for in the NIF are doing badly, and we cannot pay 4.5% over 5 years. we are obliged, let me offer you 3%. That is not possible because the time horizon is 5 years. They have to wait for 5 years and ride it out for those 5-year bonds to see if they can offer lower rates. So that really raises the question as to the going concern of those companies and the strength of those companies going forward. Because this was one of the main reasons, Madam President, why the population, the economy, had problems with CLICO. They were offering rosy returns that the underlying assets that supported CLICO could not support. So we really hope, and again, it's sad that I have to be using words like hope when it comes to financial analysis. I should be saying, based on a probability of X or Y, they should be able to make these returns in the future. So to me, I find that once we have these types
Senator Beaker, Honourable Senators, at this stage we will suspend the sitting and we will return at 5 p.m.